Welcome to the Western Illinois University Social Justice Summit. My name is Jill Bisbee, and I'm your host for this session, along with my colleague, Kelly Larrabee.
Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Larrabee, and I echo Jill's welcome and am delighted you're joining us today. Thank you for your participation. We would like to express our sincere appreciation to the Quad Cities Grad Center for sponsoring today's webinar, along with our esteemed colleagues. We'll begin in just a few moments, but first Jill will review the Zoom features we will use for today's session. Enjoy the webinar.
The toolbar is located across the bottom of your screen. The Q&A button allows you to send questions and comments to the presenter at any time during this session. The Q&A button is also our logistics hub. Use that as a resource to let us know about technology issues you are experiencing, and we'll do our best to address those. During today's session, the presenters will ask you questions as a group using the polling feature. The questions will pop up on the center of your screen and you'll have an opportunity to respond. Different from Zoom meetings that we've all become familiar with over the last few months, we will not be utilizing the chat function or the raise hand function so that everything funnels through the Q&A button. Today's session is the fourth webinar focused on equity and inclusion within higher education, honoring the face behind the mask, interrogating masculine performatives to promote retention. And Dr. Tracy Davis will get us started.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you, Jill and Kelly, for the nice introduction. And joining me today are two outstanding scholars that I've had the pleasure of working with over the last few weeks, pulling this together. What we thought we'd do is tell you a little bit about something, or a little bit of something about what kind of drew us into this particular topic. So I'll start. My name's Tracy Davis, and I'm a professor at Western Illinois University. And I kind of got into this, the issues around men and masculinities, first of all, from just thinking about my own life and the kind of messages that I've been sold. And then when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, I took a look at sexual assault prevention for men. And one of the things that I discovered or reinforced is that there's something around masculinity, the way men think of themselves and learn how to be men, that has something to do with violence. And I continue to be interested in exploring those kinds of topics. Vern?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. So my name is Vern Klobassa. I work at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. I use he, him pronouns. Generally, I will say that it's been my experience with masculinities and coming to consciousness about both the ways in which I inappropriately benefit from a system of patriarchy and simultaneously have also been harmed by that very same system that has really drawn me into this work. So gender and masculinity have been identities that I've spent a lifetime learning, relearning, unlearning. And I'll just share that just as I believe that racial justice is not just an issue for folks of color, but also white folks, I believe that gender-based oppression is not just an issue for women and gender non-conforming folks, but also for men to engage with as well. So that's another thing that's drawn me to this work. So I'll pass to Keenan.
Hi, my name is Keenan Colquitt. Working at Northern Michigan University, teaching in the higher education and student affairs program here. And as a young man, I've long since questioned how masculinity, gender roles, and expectations of guided men's behavior. Really spent a lot of time thinking about why men do some of the things that they do, specifically some of the more toxic behaviors that men engage in, and just try to figure out and understand how the societal expectations for men drive the behavior that we engage in. And decided to try to research some of the good things that men do, some of the socially acceptable things, because, well, I think that's a lot to be learned from that. Like Tracy and Vern, I walk into this presentation with a lot of privilege. Now that I've become aware of that privilege, working in student affairs and as faculty, the question becomes, what do we do with it?
Thanks, Keenan and Vern. We wanted to start today with the land acknowledgement for each of us presenting today. Western Illinois University rests on the ancestral homeland of the Kickapoo community?
Northern Michigan University rests on the ancestral homeland of Anishinaabe people.
Thanks, Keenan. The University of St. Thomas and Minnesota occupy the ancestral lands and contemporary homes of the Chippewa, Dakota, Ojibwe, and Sioux nations.
We also want to share that land acknowledgements don't exist in a past tense or only in a historical context. Settler colonialism is a current ongoing process, is alive and well today, and we need to build our mindfulness around our present engagement, our present participation. I thought we'd give you an overview. I thought I'd give you an overview of what we're going to do today so you kind of have a path for what you're expecting to receive. The first section, I'm going to spend about 15 minutes with you just kind of framing men and masculinities, give some background information. Then I'm going to turn it over to Keenan, who just completed an outstanding doctoral dissertation where he did some research and found out about the lived experiences of particular men. I'll let him tell you that story. And then we're going to end with what I think many of you are joining us here to talk about, and that's the strategies for practice. Vern's been has been a professional in the field for quite a while, has been focused on social justice issues and identities in general, but in particular has also done a lot with men and masculinities. He and I, in fact, this webinar came from something he and I had written a while ago.
So just a quick word about learning outcomes. We just wanted to mention that learning around this topic is not something that can be done in a 60-minute webinar, right? So our hope for today is that in each of the sections that Tracy outlined, that we're able to provide folks with some nuggets, some insights, some areas for further exploration for you to continue your learning and growth along this journey. So
one more piece of kind of housekeeping. Feel free to go ahead and enter any questions you have. If we get a whole bunch, we might have we have a little bit of time at the end. We may go ahead and raise them as we go a little bit, but one of the things that we are going to do is spend some time with those questions at the end, and we're going to send you either our verbal interaction where we get together after this and record and send it out to everybody, or we may do some typing and interacting and send that to you along with our handout at the end. So let's jump into our first poll question. Think about how familiar you are with the topic of men and masculinities, and go ahead and yeah, respond there. Probably just going to keep this open about 25 seconds or so. Okay, probably no surprises there. Keenan, Vern, anything you see that surprised you with that percentages?
No, it's great.
Yeah, it looks pretty standard. Most people, the majority, have read and are somewhat engaged. I've been there quite a bit, and thank you all for sharing your results. You kind of get a sense of who's joining us. Okay. You know, one of kind of our pet peeves over the time, or you know, as we do a lot of work, there are a lot of people that are doing a lot of really outstanding work at our national associations, at our colleges and universities, and it felt odd for the three of us to get together and talk about these topics without honoring some of the folks whose shoulders we stand on, who we interact with, who sometimes we've been in relationship for years and we've argued with, we've cried with, we've gone through. I mean, that's what this work looks like. I don't think if you hit a point where you hit your defenses, I'm not sure you're really dealing with the issues substantively. So you'll see just a rock star group of people And there are more people we could have added, but these are the ones that we selected. You also see some resources that we would recommend to you. And again, we're going to have a handout that will have the citations for you. I should let you know too that we selected 3 people from this group to say something about framing men and masculinities. There's no way that we can represent every lived experience. We can bring scholarship, philosophical perspectives, and our own lived experiences to this conversation, but there are things we can't bring. And so we have 3 scholars who we've asked the question, hey, could you help us frame men and masculinities? What's on your mind? And these are 3 really powerful scholars who we respect tremendously. The first one here is T.J. Jurian.
My name is T.J. Jurian. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm an independent scholar and consultant with Transformational Change, LLC. If there is one thing I would want educators who are invested in the work of interrogating gender-based oppression to do is to dismantle the de facto practice of equating men with masculinities. Even as we start with framing, let's interrogate how are we framing men and how are we framing masculinities in such a way that assumes they are always already intertwined and completely overlapping. When we start from framing them as interchangeable, we inevitably limit men's possibilities, meaning we do not allow them to embrace or embody femininities or androgyny. And we ignore all the other gendered manifestations of masculinities, such as trans men and other masculine-centered individuals, including masculine women, cis and trans, and non-binary masculinities. When the dominant paradigm is to always equate the two, this is much easier said than done and requires consistency, intentional reflection, and accountable praxis.
Second, thank you, Dr. Jurian. The second one we have is Dr. Keith Edwards.
Hi there, my name is Keith Edwards. I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach, and you can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. I guess the thing I'd want to share with you about framing of men and masculinities, when I started my dissertation research on college men's identity more than a decade ago, I went into that thinking we need to teach college men a different way of being a man, because the ways that they are being men is toxic and harmful to themselves and others, people of other genders, and to the whole campus community. We need to teach college men a different way of being a man. What I learned through my research is that's not actually the case. What we need to do is we need to give men permission to stop being the men they feel they have to be and permission to be who they really are. Who those men were wasn't perfect, but it was far more authentic, it was more genuine, and it was much more pro-social in how they were navigating that. So that would be the lesson I would offer. We don't need to change men, but we need to give them permission to stop being who they feel they have to be and start being who they really are, including ourselves. Good luck.
Thanks, Keith. And then finally, the third person that we asked to frame is frame men and masculinities is David Perez at Syracuse University.
Justin Howell, Sean Monterosa, Jamel Floyd. You may not recognize these names, but these are Black and Latino men who were injured or killed last week by law enforcement officers in the wake of George Floyd's senseless murder. I think of these men and many others who have been profiled, targeted, and subjected to violence by those who swore to protect and serve our communities. I am no stranger to this. During my tenure at Miami University, I was profiled by police officers on more than one occasion. One time I was traveling with my 8-year-old son to soccer practice when I heard the sirens and observed the flashing lights. As I pulled over to the shoulder of the road, I wondered, is this it? Will my son and I become hashtags? Out of curiosity, my son peered over the back seat to look out the rear window as the officer exited his vehicle. In that moment, all I could think to say was, don't move. As I lowered all the windows in my car, turned the ignition off, and rested my wrist with outstretched fingers on the steering wheel. My heart pounded as the officer approached our vehicle, with hands on the holster of his gun. Less than a year later, a parent called Syracuse University's campus police to report that I was engaging in suspicious activity. I was simply sitting in my parked car, reading a book about the history of racism and slavery in higher education, just a few minutes before picking up my 1-year-old daughter from her daycare center on campus. As I was placing my daughter in her car seat, I was approached by 2 campus police officers that blocked my car with their vehicles. In that moment, I experienced a range of emotions: confusion, fear, anger, and embarrassment. Again, I pondered, is this it? Will my daughter and I become hashtags? As I reflect back on these moments, I'm left wondering, how do men of color make sense of how they and the communities they're from are policed on and off campus? Because we're always being monitored, we've learned to police our words and our actions. I wonder, who do we go to on campus to process these experiences? Or better yet, when men of color do not seek out support from faculty and staff on college campuses, what conclusions are drawn about them? Do we simply say they're not exercising good help-seeking behaviors? Or have we considered that Black and Latino men do not seek you out because they receive cues from others that convey their lives do not matter?
I want to thank the 3 scholars for Dr. Perez, Dr. Edwards, and Dr. Jurian for helping us frame men and masculinities in meaningful ways. Keenan or Vern, anything you want to add to what we just saw?
Sorry, I'm trying to get back into, I appreciate what Dr. Perez brought into the conversation. It's an ever present issue, and it's something that many professionals like myself are having to do right now. Put that trauma in your back pocket and put on a strong face so you can present and be present for the other individuals, especially on campus, who may need you, and individuals who may be looking for you for guidance or instruction. It is exhausting, which I'm sure is a word that many feel. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just really briefly and say that I think what we heard emphasizes to me how important intersectionality is in this work, and the idea that men are privileged by a system of patriarchy, but are also harmed by patriarchy, and especially at some of the intersections that we've heard from some of these scholars discussing.
I agree with what you're saying, and in fact, one of the more powerful books that I've read on men and masculinities, or scholar that I've listened to in the last decade, has been Bell Hooks, and I think she illustrates what Vern just said, that men also pay a price for the patriarchy. And the good news about that is that when men start realizing, let me stop talking about men, let me talk about myself for just a second. The way that it's impacted me personally, I got to be honest with you, I still have those scripts playing. And when I can interrupt them and be conscious of them and choose other gendered or just other human ways of being, it's liberating compared to being locked into a certain performance, wondering about my masculinity. And we're going to talk about some of those concepts that are associated with that. I want to also reinforce what Keenan said related to Dr. Perez's statement, you know, it illustrates what both of them illustrate, is that when we talk about men and masculinities, we need to consider the overlapping oppressions that a variety of men experience, because their lived experiences will be different depending on the constellation and the overlapping oppressions. And quite honestly, what the research says is that history and context matter tremendously as well. So we invite you into continued conversation around these issues. I just kind of wanted to reinforce, and that we're going to be heading in this direction of masking and of you know, we talk about a certain kind of masculinity. To set that up, I remember Hermann Hesse in Siddhartha talking or writing about there's no reality except that contained within us. Kind of an Eastern view focuses on the internal, and it moves us to think about how false the external images are until we make them our own. There's that process. It should remind some of you of self-authorship, or Robert, you know, Marcia Baxter Magolda's work, or Robert Keegan's work, in terms of what these constellations or external demands are. And there's nothing wrong particularly with the external in and of themselves. It's when we make them when we think we make them our own, and we're performing to meet some external standard. And again, we're going to get into that a little bit more. We'd like to be clear there. We think it's important to talk about toxic masculinity for just a moment. One of the things that we advocate is, I mean, there is toxic masculinity. I mean, I believe there's toxic masculinity. And I define it pretty much as the masculinity that men put on to perform something to get certain benefits, rather than being an authentic self. So that mask that people put on, that where aggression, other kinds of femininity is denigrated, those are toxic forms of masculinity that certainly have a deleterious impact on other people, dramatically negative impact, but also have a negative impact on men. And so when we talk about toxic masculinity, we talk about it as a particular form of masculinity. And then when you think about, well, how does that get constructed? How does masculinity, how does gender impinge on, and masculinity in particular, impinge on how we begin to think of ourselves? Most people generally, I remember Jean Kilbourne, when she talked about how advertising's impact on women, talked about, you know, that most people believe that they're not impacted by hegemonic standards or these advertisings. And one of the things that she says is that it wouldn't be a billion or multi-billion-dollar industry if it didn't have the impact. So hegemony is this process through which, of influence through which people consent to their own harm. Basically, it controls what gets rejected, what gets accepted. And again, the insidious beauty of this is that people actually believe that this is good for them. Let me give you just a real quick grounded example of this. We're talking about masks. We're talking about masculinity. And we're also, if you think about the mask that you put on to go outside, have you noticed a gender relationship? Have you noticed that men seem to have a harder time putting on the mask than people of other genders, and so of other sexes? And so I think that hegemony works that way. If when I put on my mask, I'm like, oh, does that make me weak? When I associate some political or external demand according to a behavior that could save another person's life, you have hegemony going on, and you see it performed everywhere. It's like fish in water. It's absolutely everywhere. I would direct you to Gramsci and some other scholars, Connell, who I think Keenan is going to talk about a little bit later regarding hegemony. So I want to foreground Vern's section. I know this is what everybody's kind of wants to get into some conversation about what do you do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to foreground this nonviolent communication or nonviolent compassionate communication model. So if you think about what hegemony is, it's kind of blindly accepting what the rule makers tell you to believe. So when you start authoring that yourself, that's done through critical inquiry, a critical theoretical approach, learning how history needs to be rewritten and re-understood, because oftentimes what you've learned in grade school are actually lies. Mindful reflection, quieting the external. And so one of those processes, or one of those practices, is NVC. Briefly, what it is you make an observation, and anybody that's worked with anybody of different political persuasions, we don't all see the same things. So you have to have conversation with another person to talk about what we observe. And then we have feelings associated with those observations. We think we know how another person's feeling, oftentimes from their physical reaction, sometimes from, my eyebrows kind of go down, and sometimes people think I'm mad when I'm just like, oh, I'm thinking. So, sometimes we misinterpret that. And that's one of the beauties of this model too, is you're not just taking somebody else's inventory. It asks you to look in the mirror and think about your own assumptions around that observation, your own feelings that you're feeling as you're assuming what that person's feeling. And then we all have the same needs. If you distill much of our humanity to needs, you find that we all have very similar ones. The challenge there is to connect that feeling to a need. And then, of course, to be able to make a request to get those needs met mutually. So I just kind of wanted to give you that as a practice that I found seductively, seemingly simple, but much harder than it is. And it also it doesn't capture everything. From a critical theory, I found critical theory to balance nicely with compassion and working both of those. Don't either or it by focusing only on NVC without a critical perspective, and vice versa. At this point, we've talked about the mask, and I want to turn it over to Keenan to talk a little bit about his research and what's behind the mask.
Thank you very much. Just to start talking about my research, I did an in-depth assessment of relevant literature, as we all do when getting started on dissertations or research of that or any of that. And I found that the majority of research on college men is conducted using a deficit model, focusing on men's bad behavior. Most of these studies involve collecting data from men who are engaging in negative or toxic practices, and engaging in what Jason Laker would call bad dogging, diminishing students in response to their unwanted behavior. And I also found that a large percentage of the literature in relation to college men presents an essentialist relationship between hegemonic masculinity and engaging in negative or toxic practices. My study sought to address these issues. My investigation sampled men who were addressing toxic behavior, specifically men's violence on their college and university campuses. The study focused on understanding men who engage in socially desirable or positive behavior. This allowed for a better understanding of college men who embody positive attributes found desirable by college and university administrators. The purpose of the study was to explore the experiences men who participated in violence prevention groups had. By studying the nature of these experiences, college and university administrators should be able to get a better understanding of who these men are. That included specifically who are they, how do they align, where do they come from, what are the attributes that make them similar to others. In addition, studying the experiences of these men, it revealed what we can do to perpetuate that behavior on college and university campuses. So my methodology, I love this picture. It's a fun picture. Purpose of the study was to understand the stories of men who participated in anti-violence initiatives. To do this, I conducted a qualitative study and I utilized narrative analysis. The constructivist paradigm was used to frame my philosophical assumptions. Participants' stories were obtained using semi-structured interviews, which were designed to illustrate responses to my research questions. Though that information is going to be available in the handout. I don't want to get too deep into things. But to quickly speak to gender being socially constructed, researchers like Coltrane and Connell state that gender is a social construct that is emergent and malleable across culture. Gender is Connell specifically addressing gender in relation to the ethnographic moment, which includes specific time and date, the milieu, the social environment, the social context. These are all things that go into the social construct of gender. This is why the way that men behave that is considered masculine changes over time, and it changes for the situation. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Study took place at a 4-year public institution, Midwest. I named the university Snowy State, hence the picture. This is not the university, this is another university. I can't remember which one it is actually. University had population was less than 8,000. Undergraduates were usually under 25 years of age. Regardless, the participants of the study all were part of this group. I named them men's group, and they were fantastic individuals. I met every last one of the people of the study through this group. They're all white, cisgender, straight men, which is something that I would like to discuss later on in the study. But those individuals represented the demographics of the institution. The group, however, that my participants were a part of included, wow, it was pretty diverse. It had members who self-identified as genderqueer and transgender. Women were part of the group. It was a refreshing group to study and sit with. We can go to the next slide. Beautiful. Okay. 4 narratives came out of this study, and they get represented as my findings. 3 of the narratives are placed into time periods: childhood, adolescent, and college. Through the act of storytelling, the participants shared their lived experiences, and they just talked about how they learned how to become men, what that meant, how college changed and affected that, and how the group had an effect on how they defined their masculinity. The last narrative, and I found this to be somewhat emergent, is discourse, and it followed a theoretical framework of discourse. In defining their masculinity, the men oftentimes spoke of media and institutions that taught them what it meant to be men and the effect that those institutions had on just who they were and what they saw as acceptable behavior for men. Beginning with the most overarching form of discourse, I talked about 3. Social discourse is an umbrella term that illustrates society's ideology of normality. What is normal? This form of discourse speaks to how an individual, as a competent member of society, would be expected to behave. Although similarly overarching in nature, cultural discourse is situated in a subsidiary position to social discourse. It reflects on messages that are more nuanced and formative. This form of discourse speaks to how an individual, as a competent member of society in the United States, would be expected to behave. Now, gender discourse is a far more subtle form of discourse than mentioned prior. Describes a much more nuanced information of what is understood to be normal regarding masculinity and femininity behavior, or feminine behavior, respectively. This form of discourse speaks to how men, as competent members of society, would be expected to behave. So, my conclusions. The participants of my study enacted positive or productive masculinity as articulated by Harrison Harper's study in 2014, I believe. The participants, as members of men's group, they didn't prioritize homophobia, misogyny, or toxic dating habits. They consciously acted in ways that challenged toxic masculinity, sexism, and traditional masculine norms. The members of the group sought substantive relationships with women on campus, and they confronted male peers that they observed engaging in toxic behavior. Subsequently, the members of men's group also exemplified concept of inclusive masculinity as presented by Anderson's paper in 2011. And they demonstrated tolerance and an acceptance of, these are Anderson's words, homosexuality. They value emotional intimacy, and they engage in acts of physical tactility. They actually touched and they didn't stave off that physical contact that's normally associated with homosocial bonds between other men. Anderson coined an inclusive masculinity to describe men who challenge orthodox or traditional masculine values to create a masculine archetype that embodies inclusivity, contest homophobia, and resist misogynist discourse. So in listening to the stories that these men told me, the men in my study, it was clear that they wanted to do the same thing. They wanted to challenge patriarchy and hierarchical norms that privilege men over women. They wanted to challenge toxic behavior. However, the men of my study, they stopped short of doing that. They stopped short of challenging hegemony on the campus. They in fact illustrated examples that enacted hegemonic masculinity. And I say that, and I almost feel a need to come back and say they were good men, as if following social hierarchy means that you're bad. It just means that you're responding to years of discourse teaching you how to behave. It is entirely possible for a man to enact hegemonic masculinity and behave in a socially acceptable manner while reinforcing gender inequality and perpetuating hegemony. According to Connell, this is from a paper in 1995, men who are most successful in ascending social hierarchy can determine what behaviors are favorable by society and engage in those behaviors. That's what the men in my study did. And the last slide. Beautiful. For an individual to disrupt hegemonic masculinities and to actively reject being complacent and sustaining hegemony, that person must do the following. They must actively work to become aware of and understand their privilege. They must intentionally engage in actions that challenge inequality. This practice can be understood as undoing gender or masculinity. The participants in my study described creating educational environments that focused on challenging social norms associated with toxic behavior. One of the participants used feminist ideals to actively combat toxic masculinity through educational programming and individual outreach. Did slut walks and gender fairs and topic talks. Another individual expressed disappointment with educational programming offered by his institution as he felt it reinforced toxic behavior in men. He stated that men's group would engage in initiatives that redress these issues. Although elements of the program that they described address gender equality, they didn't always present examples of initiatives that centered on countering gender disparity. The men of the group, fantastic as they were, presented examples of them promoting and attending events designed to support women. And additionally, they described partnering with other social activist groups towards that goal. They were exuberant in their service, but they often took up space that presented themselves as authorities to correct the behavior they observed. While this action in itself is not problematic, the participants described engaging in educational programs and outreach prior to sometimes obtaining a really solid grasp of the topics that they wish to correct. Men in the study engaged in numerous activities designed to address gender equality. They sought to educate themselves and their peers, but they stopped short of challenging norms. Basically, what I'm saying is the men in the study, and by extension, men's group as a whole, they were intrinsically motivated to do good work. They see themselves as heroes, fighting the good fight and trying to make the world a better place. Heroes is a pervasive term used in masculinity and manhood. It represents the idealized form of gender performance. But they traded often aggression for assertiveness and physical strength for strength of character. But they're righteous and just in their eyes. Stated plainly, the men or the participants in my study engaged in socially acceptable behaviors. They challenged the normalization of toxic masculinity, but they still engaged in hegemonic masculinity. 4, how can a person move to challenge a system of oppression if they're not willing to consider their place within it or how that system privileges them? I think that's the best way that my research applies to what we're talking about today, focusing on our goals of challenging, disrupting patriarchy.
Keenan, I'm always amazed after coming out of a research project that some of my assumptions, even going in of what when it's qualitative, my assumptions when I go in about how that interview is going to go, I'm kind of blown away very often. It sounds like you had some of that experience too, where, you know, when you hear what's going on behind the scenes and you get somebody telling their story, you know, there's this listening people into voice, even when the behavior on the front side is just, and not excusing that behavior. Like, I'm not a boys will be boys fan. Like, that's bullshit. We're not gonna, that's inappropriate, I should say. You know, we're not gonna excuse behaviors that harm other people or aren't pro-social. So I appreciate the stories that you shared with us. I want to get to a quick question before we jump to Vern. Tommy Newsom says, when we talk about masculinity, or asks, when we talk about masculinity being constructed, can you speak to how that might differ based on cultural context, specifically as it relates to race, working at emerging Hispanically serving institutions in American Indian, you know, serving institutions, it's becoming more prominent. My first response to that is that the context very often depends on, I mean, there are certainly symbols in the environment that are quite in the context, you know, what the mission statement is, what posters are up, what kind of graffiti is up, what kind of sensitivity there is, who shows up. Like, the human aggregate is a huge one. So that if you walk into a space and you're the only one, whatever that means, that's when you feel disengaged. There's a performativity that comes in. And what I think the three of us have discovered is when, and this is kind of related to Alex Dumming's question, when men become vulnerable with each other, all of a sudden the mask can come down. Now, oftentimes that's with alcohol. It doesn't need to be. We've all been in spaces, and I would say that the research that both of these men have done has illustrated that when they do their interviews, when they've created space for men in men's groups or just one-on-one, you don't get the masculinity performance unless I initiate it. Remember, the script is there, and I can either accentuate it or bring it down. My own behavior with other people in the room impacts how they'll go about behaving. So I know that doesn't comprehensively answer that question, but anything else regarding that question?
I'll just throw in there that I think there's some great studies out there, and we can make sure to include, if they're not already in there, I got to go back to the handout, but make sure to include some of those references where you can start to look at the nuances of those intersections of masculinities with other identities, because there is some great research out there. So we'll be sure to include that in the handout too.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. And we'll get to Kyle and Alex's questions, but let's turn it over to Vern.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Tracy, I'm actually going to have you skip ahead one more.
Okay.
So real quick, I just want to say, first of all, Keenan, I think what your study reminds me and what you articulated reminds me when I first started in the profession, and this is related to my masculinity, the intersection of my masculinity and whiteness, but I wanted to look at, how do we do this? What does it look like to do this? And as I got into that, it always sent me back to the research and how can I make meaning of this practice? And as I got back into the research, it always pushed me back to, what does it look like to translate this into practice? It was, I think what you illustrated, Keenan, is praxis at its finest. This iterative, it's theory and practice informing one another. So I wanted to throw that out there. I think it's a great illustration. So as we shift into this conversation, wanted to talk a little bit about what some of the practice pieces look like in student affairs and higher education more broadly. So I want to go through some of the things that we see, and then we'll do a quick poll question in a second. But some of the common strategies that you see in student affairs and higher education include men's retreats. I often see these being leveraged as opportunities to create a supportive environment for students to unlearn toxic or hegemonic masculine actions or patterns of behavior, as Keenan was kind of talking about too with the men's group, and we'll talk about groups in a second. Dialogue programs. So sometimes these are in-group dialogues, sometimes these are intergroup dialogues. I think they're often helpful in providing spaces for critical self-reflection, unpacking assumptions, beliefs, previously learned knowledge. Peer education. So having students serve as educators with other students. I often see these situated in health promotion units addressing topics of physical and mental health, such as alcohol consumption, sexual violence prevention. Sometimes you'll see these within residence life units, sort of as a train-the-trainer model, leveraging RAs to engage residential students in dialogue, putting gender on the radar, or again, unlearning these toxic or hegemonic masculine patterns of behavior or actions. You'll see student clubs and organizations. I've often, again, seen these oriented towards anti-violence or sexual violence prevention groups, men against violence, those kinds of opportunities. But there are certainly other types of student clubs and organizations out there as well, focusing on topics. I've seen performance groups. I've seen various groups that are oriented towards supporting minoritized or racialized populations. Mentoring programs. These are often focused again on supporting racialized or marginalized groups on campus as a retention or student success programs. Living learning communities. What I'll say about those is I think we often see those less specifically focused on men and masculinities, but certainly leveraged as a strategy to put gender on the radar within specific communities. So an example that I could give would be, let's take a living learning community focused on STEM or engineering. That can be an avenue to interrogate what are the gendered experiences and what do they look like within STEM fields or engineering, those kinds of things. And then last but not least, academic curriculum. So courses that exist as in their totality or parts of courses within the academic curriculum that are addressing either gender more broadly or taking a deep dive into men and masculinities. You'll also see on the slide the cover of a book, a really great book. It was edited by Dan Tillpaugh and Brian McGowan, and a lot of what I mentioned here is teased out more deeply in this book. So I just want to elevate that as a reference as folks are wanting to learn more, and we'll have that on our handout as well. Tracy, if you go to the next slide. What I wanted to do now is just do a quick poll. So I think Jill will put the poll up here. What are the most common strategies related to doing social justice work around men and masculinities that you've seen in higher education? So we'll take a couple of seconds for folks to respond to that. And as you're responding, I just want to comment that I think these things can vary based on a number of factors, right? So what kind of institution are you at? A public, private? How large is your campus? What's the campus climate around gender and masculinity? What are the demographics of your institution? I think that was noted in the question that we had as well. I think some other more nuanced factors include who on your campus is interested in doing this work, right? Who shares a passion for doing this work? What are the coalitions you can build about starting some work around this on your campus? Additionally, mission, values, strategic priorities. Is the conversation on your campus focused on retention, enrollment, student engagement? What are those kind of buzzwords? As a sidebar, I think mission, values, and strategies can be ripe with what a colleague of mine talks about, leveraging the language of power, right? So what's the discourse on your campus, and how might you be able to leverage those priorities or those conversations to engage in this important work? So it looks like the polls are in, and you know, you see certainly clubs and organizations up there as top, dialogue programs. So none of this, I think, is surprising, but I thought it would be interesting for folks to kind of see what others are seeing out in the field. So I'm going to close this, and Tracy, I'm going to ask you to go to the next screen. Thanks. So Robert Keegan's work, and Tracy mentioned Keegan earlier, his work on learning positions, I think, offers a really nice framework for ensuring that the tools and strategies that we're engaging as professionals are matching learners' meaning-making capacities, you know, meeting students where they're at. And so in his work, Keegan argues that that this is not only an intellectual process, but it's an intrapersonal process in terms of learners making meaning of what they've always known and new information that they're encountering. He also explains that it's an interpersonal process, right? This is a process that's negotiated in space with other people. And so I think those are important things to note. Keegan identifies 3 learning positions. You kind of see a chart here on the screen here with learning position, response from the educator, and then some tools and strategies that you might match to sort of meet learners where they're at. So this first learner position that Keegan articulates is defending. And Keegan argues that individuals in this learning position seek to defend what they've learned and protect this worldview from threats of new information. So Keegan argues that we as educators should be meeting individuals in this learning position with confirmation. And so Keegan describes that the goal of this is to create an environment where defenses are either more permeable or diffused. So I'm going to use an example, and this example actually comes from Tracy's book on social justice. Let's say you have a student who uses the term gay in a sentence to mean the word stupid. So I know my immediate reaction is I'm upset by that, right? So our immediate reaction in this situation could be to employ, and Keenan mentioned this earlier, a bad dogging approach, right? Where we scold, we shame the student, we may punish them for behaving in such a terrible way. And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves as educators in this moment is, do we want to feel good or do we want to be effective? The only learning that a student's going to take away from a feel-good, bad dogging, shaming response is, better not say that in front of Vern again. Meeting students with confirmation and can crack open opportunities for further learning, possibilities for further learning. So I want to reiterate too that Keegan is not talking about confirming the appropriateness of the behavior. Rather, given how we know we're socialized in this society, we're confirming that it makes sense that someone would learn to use this term in this way, and that it's natural that, you know, a student may feel confusion or defensiveness when encountered with new information. So some ways of meeting students with confirmation may include asking questions. When you said the term gay, what did you mean by that? Identifying commonalities. Keegan talks a little bit about this. And I think it's important to do that in a genuine way. So for me, I might share that, you know, with a student who I'm working with on this, you know, there was a time in my life when I used this term in the same way that you did. Again, building a commonality. I'm not proud that I've done that, but it's true, I have. But it's true and it's genuine and it's building a commonality with student. And that can seek to make those defenses more permeable again. So I also think modeling respectful listening is important. And then in terms of like maybe more formal educational context, like a formal dialogue or something of that nature, setting ground rules is a really helpful low risk response that then you can rely on later in that. So the other thing that I want to talk a little bit about is some additional tools, right? So Keegan talks, well, and Tracy talk a little bit about low risk activities in these kinds of group settings, right? So some activities that I've done that are low risk that can help to put gender on the radar and meet students in this defending position, defining masculinities exercises. So I've done activities where I've broken students into groups and maybe had them, I assign them a particular phase of life, right? Grade school, high school, college, asking questions. What did you learn about gender and how did you learn it, right? Little lower risk. You're engaging with this question of gender and masculinity and how we construct that. Another activity is a man box activity, and this is pretty common in the literature and stuff too, but you ask students, have you ever heard the phrase act like a man or man up? You draw a box on the board, you write that at the top. So what does that phrase mean? And what are the expectations? And either you put them in the box or you invite folks to do that. And then on the outside, you ask the question, what happens when men deviate from that, right? And you put those on the outside, and then you can have a conversation where you're articulating a process of gender policing, right? How we are keeping men in this sort of constructed box of hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculine behaviors, those kinds of things. Another important tool that I just want to mention that Tracy talks through that I'd like to come back to is nonviolent compassionate communication, or nonviolent communication, NVC. So I want to give an example. I think that NVC could be used in any one of these learner positions, but I think in particular defending is an appropriate place for this. So I'm going to give an example. So let's say you're engaging in an intergroup dialogue program, and once and the conversation is steering toward a discussion about patriarchy, men's privilege, and you notice that one of your participants who identifies as a man is crossing his arms, shaking his head, frowning. So a way that you might engage NVC as a tool in this context, and again, it's observations, feelings, needs, and requests. So observations. I've noticed you were frowning and shaking your head. Feelings. It was just talking about requests, right? So I want you to think back about the ground rules that we identified, and that assuming good intentions was one of those ground rules. I want you to trust that nobody in the group was intending to personally attack you, and I'd like you to share what you're thinking or feeling, right? So again, observations, feelings, needs, and requests can be really, really helpful strategy in that. The next learning position that Keegan articulates is surrendering. And he describes this as, the learner begins to let go of passively received dogmas and knowledge and begin exploring and constructing new meanings. So Keegan argues that educators should meet students in this position with contradiction. And what he means by that is helping students to explore, new information, helping them to see contradictions or paradoxes in their previous thinking. He acknowledges that anger and frustration are part of that process as the learner wrestles with this new information. I'm gonna try and speed it up because I want to get to questions. I think counter narratives are super helpful tools in this learning position, and these are narratives that expose students to different ways of thinking, different perspectives that they've previously had. They could be stories, readings, videos, or other examples. And I also think retreats can be a helpful way for, dedicated time for students to take a deep dive and learn this new information, but also in a dialogical way where students can process this new information as well. So I think that's helpful strategy. I want to skip ahead really quickly to this last piece. I'm going to, the third position that Keegan articulates is reintegration and meeting that with continuity. And I think that that we've got resources on the handout that you'll be able to take a deeper look at this. So I'm going to kind of jump ahead so we can get to some questions. I just want to close by sharing that, sharing this image. So when I think about the work, doing social justice work with college men, I think that it may often feel to students that we're asking them to do what's happening in this photo here. So as we know, as men, we're socialized into a system of patriarchy. We're taught very well and sophisticatedly about adopting sexist and patriarchal behaviors and patterns of behavior. And I think especially with college men, you know, in environments where hegemonic masculinity seems so pervasive, it's the air that we breathe. I think when we're engaging men in this process of unlearning and relearning, it can feel to them as though they're, one, fish out of water, and two, that we're asking them to engage in a whole new way of being or hop from one fishbowl to another. And that's maybe not where the rest of their peers are at as well. So I thought this was a kind of a helpful visual, and I just want to encourage that as we continue to engage in this work, that we do so both with accountability for ourselves and for the students we're working with, but also with empathy. And I think that'll get us a lot further. So I'm going to throw back to Tracy.
Appreciate that, Vern. The recommendations that he outlines, again, we will contain, some of that will be contained in the book that he referenced with Brian McGowan and Dan Tillapaw. And also we will provide you a series of handouts and responses to the questions. I don't believe we'll get to all of them. And so we will, by the time you get something sent to you, we will have responded. I do want to jump to a question for Keenan that Kyle Ashley asked, and that was, I just lost it here. I think it got listed.
That's because I was being proactive. That's my ADD, and I answered it via text. I can speak to the question.
I see that now. Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Ashley asked about any influences in my study that allowed men to transverse and to grow in their gender identity development. And I spoke to men being involved, one in men's group, but that was something that happened in college. There were instances of men interacting with folks who are different from them, meeting and interacting with people that they didn't before, had a positive effect. Simply being exposed to new information, they sought out information in men's studies, and they learned about feminist theory that allowed them to re-envision some of their perspectives on masculinity and ask some difficult questions. These are some things that allowed the men in my study to reconsider how they had previously defined their masculine identities and expand it. Now, I will couch all of that in saying that men in my study were ferocious in their reading, and they were really trying to relearn things. We all know, and I worked in student affairs, that just because you take some people and throw them in a room together and they're all different, that doesn't necessarily mean growth is going to happen. There has to be intentionality behind that. And I respect that. I completely agree with these men in my study, because they had the mindset that allowed and pushed for relearning and unlearning. They were able to take advantage of new and differing perspectives.
Alex Dumming, earlier on in our webinars, asked what value exists in encouraging guiding male peer groups to promote behavioral change and express vulnerability and care with one another. What challenges exist in trying to do something like this? Vern?
Yeah, I think some of the value that exists, and it part of it depends on, you know, what kind of learner positions that you're working with too, and what the goals of the group are. So I'll preface by saying that I think that they can be spaces where students can work together, as Keenan talked about in his study, you know, negotiating out what does it look like to engage in a different way of being, and trying to work toward more pro-social, anti-oppressive behaviors. I think some of the challenges are some of what Keenan talked about, right? Like you end up engaging in, it also cracks open possibilities for continuing to engage in ways that are conforming with toxic masculine behaviors or hegemonic masculine behaviors. I also want to tease out just a little bit because I think it's related. You know, Keenan, as you were talking about, this focus on behaviors and patterns, I think is a theme that I'm hearing. And I see a lot of connections with Kendi's work on anti-racism, right? So Kendi offers a feedback, a framework for understanding, rather than it being an identity, we're focusing on behaviors and actions, right? And in one moment, I could be engaging in racist behaviors, right? And those he articulates as either neutral and therefore upholding a system of racism, or direct, very direct actions that are upholding a racist system. And in the very next moment, could be engaging in anti-racist behaviors, right? That are working to change a system and those kinds of things. I think this works in a similar context, right? So in one moment, and Keenan, hop in on this.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're speaking to Connell's work and other people's work on complacent masculinity and hegemonic masculinity, where men, they intentionally engage in behavior, or you can even make an argument that it's subconscious, that they feel would put them in a socially honored position. It's going to give them privilege and clout or things. So in one aspect, and I'll try to use an example, you can have, let's say, a college professor, not speaking to anyone on the panel, you can have a college professor who was vehemently in class talking about patriarchy and the negative aspects of patriarchy, and they are literally walking the walk and talking the talk. But when they go back into their staff meetings, they're perpetuating ideals that seem to consistently benefit men. The ideals that are used for, I don't know, determining that you are a great lecturer, your ability to control a class, or do you have a booming voice, and how do you present yourself? Do you look presidential? Do you know, that was a Freudian. Do you look like a professor when you're speaking, and then not speaking to the aspects of discourse that privilege men in those spaces? So yeah, I completely agree. And I think the idea of complacency with that hegemony is there. They are consciously or subconsciously aware that the behavior that they're engaging in allows them to be privileged, and they're not necessarily engaging in questioning that behavior all the time because they don't want to lose that advantage. I think that's a real problem with men specifically doing this work, because we can't always be called out for our bad behavior, our behavior that continues to perpetuate patriarchy, because we're the good guys. We're conducting the good studies, and we're doing the good research and writing the good books. But we need to be able to look. We should be able to have our behavior, our actions looked at it and said, okay, what is it doing? Are we consistently going forth and challenging those systems of oppression that privilege us, or are we just choosing to do so when it's convenient?
I want to get to maybe two more questions before we have to close it off today. One, Caleb Colon Rivera asks about gay men, and specifically have studied if they deal with hegemonic masculinity, how do they deal with hegemonic masculinity, toxic masculinity, and off of that, how does that affect their coming out or not coming out because of perceived masculinity? And this is a great question, and it illustrates something that the framing that TJ Jurian did at the very beginning of this webinar. You know, when we define masculinity as men's bodies or as men, it causes problems for everybody. And what the literature suggests, and I would point you in the direction of Judith Butler's work or Halberstam, Duger Effect. There's other research that would suggest that gay men, much like all men, struggle with these defined notions of masculinity. And you can imagine that the coming out process is often wrapped up in those masculinity standards, because at 12 years old, how do you don't know why you're getting, sometimes you don't always know why you're getting pummeled. You just know that you're not meeting, your authentic self isn't meeting some standard. And, you know, over time you figure it out, and that hegemonic standard of masculinity becomes clear, and you want to hide those. You don't want to get hit. You don't want to get either metaphorically or literally with that violence. So there's a lot of really good writing, but I think fundamentally it's a these layers of oppression, whether it's around race or class, gender or sex or religion, spirituality. These layers make it quite much more complicated for some folks than others. And until we really ask questions about that, and until we really start looking at how that's systematized and normalized, we're not going to make, you know, we have literature that helps us do some of that, but we're not effective at actually engaging other human beings and with those conversations. When we have, I've seen some transformation. I've seen people become more comfortable with who they are. They can author. That's why we call this masculinities. I want that gay man to, I don't have anything in mind for what that gay man needs to be on any of those identity dimensions other than be himself. Like, our goal is for him to ask questions so that we can, isn't it silly that we have to ask questions to get to who we authentically are? But that's a process of unmasking and of working through those layers of intersectional oppressions. And I wanted to leave this last question because it's really, and we will attend to the other ones, but this one's really hard. LT Robinson, hello, LT. It's good to. I'm glad you've joined us. I think LT works at San Antonio, University of Texas, San Antonio, and works at an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution, Latinx Thriving Institution. It's the first time I've heard the Latinx Thriving Institution. I love that. The challenge of intersectional heavy lifting has been discouraging to our team, for sure, and possible additional considerations. Thought we'd end on a question that we can't answer fully, because that's yes and more yes to that being the lived experiences of a lot of people who are targeted for oppression in this culture. I can say one thing, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. I can tell you that I need to step up. People with my identities need to step up. I have an investment, even though I'm not targeted by the same oppressions that many other folks are on the basis of race or gender and sex and sexual orientation, all those things. I have every bit of investment in my humanity to fight those, not just for other people, but for myself. My own humanity depends on it. I can tell you this journey of learning about how I'm positioned and who I am as a gendered being, as a race being. I want to make those choices. I can tell you right now, I don't want whiteness to impact. I want to re-articulate what whiteness does to me. I want that to be about Tracy, not about whiteness. Now, there might be some things that line up, and if that's the case, that's the case. But they need to be authored, and I need to be part, and not just for myself, but get active and help my colleagues who are having to do the heavy lifting. Vern or Keenan?
I mean, to your piece of the piece of the question that's referring to possible additional considerations, and I share this with the risk of saying I'm putting the burden on folks who are experiencing oppression to do this, but there's a great chapter in Dan and Brian's book, the Men and Masculinities book, Dan Tillepaugh, Brian McCowan, about coalition building. And when I think about your question, that's where my mind sort of went from a practical standpoint. Are there ways to build coalitions where you could create paths for folks to engage so that you're not doing as much of the heavy lifting? Now, I say that, and that's part of the heavy lifting is building the coalition. So I realize there's there's a contradiction there as well.
I want to leave Keenan, anything good?
No, I'm excited. I'm looking through some of these questions. It's like Christmas morning. I couldn't wait to open my presents. So I've been trying to do two things at once. So I'm quite sure someone's got a screen grab of me doing like this, reading the questions, because I think they're awesome. I can't wait to dive into them a little bit more later on. I think we're gonna do a side note conversation.
Yes, I think we'll do a video conversation. We'll send that out. I want to leave you with this before I turn it over. You know, a colleague, Dr. Layla McLeod, who also did one of these, was involved in a couple of these webinars, reminded me, related to LT's question, that, you know, we have folks right next to us who we're working with, who we need to be reaching out to. This cannot land always on people who are targeted for oppression. It's not only their work to do. In fact, it's primarily those of us who are not targeted for oppression's work to do. So I have plenty of work to do, and I need to remember that there are people right next to me that I need to support. I want to thank everybody, and I want to turn it over to Jill Bisbee and Kelly. Jill, who actually is the rock star behind all of this.
Well, thank you, Keenan, Vern, and Tracy. What a great session. And on a special note of thanks to our sponsor for the Social Justice Summit, Shirley Moore, with the Grad Center, and my colleague, Kelly Larrabee. Once today's session is closed captioned, you'll receive an email message indicating that the recording, the handout, and the slides are ready for you to view and download. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us for the Social Justice Summit webinars this month, and we look forward to learning with you in the future.